there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. This episode features a discussion between our three forum interviewees, Steve Mann, Reiko Yoshihara, and Hugh Starkey. In the session, the participants reflected on some of the things that had resonated with them upon listening to each other's interviews, asked each other questions, and responded to a question from a member of the audience. So please welcome back our panellists. So we'll now throw over to you, and what we'd like you to do, if that's okay, we'd like you to share your thoughts on each other's interviews, ask questions to each other, if that's okay, and then we'll hand over to our audience if they have any questions to ask.
Yeah, maybe if there's any connections that you've identified between the topics that were brought up in your interviews as well, maybe we could touch on some of those. Yeah. So.
Okay. This seems rather trickier in some ways, because I think I had lots of thoughts as I was going along, and maybe I'll just start with something from what Reiko was talking about, in that the whole idea of the representations of women in ELT textbooks was probably something I didn't really think about at all as I was out in Japan teaching Headway and all the rest of it. That it was only much later working. I met Sarah Banesh once, and she came and worked with Julian Edge, and then more latterly John Gray's work looking at representations, about gender, but also the neoliberalist sort of view of what textbooks are for, and we were talking about those kind of representations, and although that's not kind of my area, it's very much clearer to me now how those representations are there, and yet those are often unchallenged. But when somebody wants to introduce these debates, they're somehow seen as brainwashing. So it's a very interesting area. And the other big resonance I had from listening to you was when I was working with interviews, that I'd never really read feminist views, because I'm a man. Why would I be interested in reading that stuff? But when I did, it kind of opened up my eyes to the whole issue of interviews and empathy and disclosure, and a lot of the sort of the textbooks about research are written by men, and those kind of ways of seeing the world are very pervasive. So I really enjoyed listening to Reiko talking. And I applaud the work. It's really important, and I wish it was more widespread. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so I very much appreciated Reiko's emphasis on social justice in the classroom, and I think women's issues and feminist ideas are just one of the various issues that we have to take into the classroom, and we've got to find ways of enabling teachers to feel confident with these issues that are sensitive. It's often said that a definition of a feminist is any woman who is not a blanket or a carpet, who is just prepared to be trodden on. And so feminist issues very quickly arouse antagonisms, I think. And yet they are the central issue. They are there in every workplace, in every family unit, domestic unit, and so on. So we need some principles that teachers can be confident that they have the moral authority to engage with these issues in the classroom, in spite of what their Ministry of Education may say or their parents may say. There are sources of moral authority beyond that, such as, I would say, the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So by helping teachers to understand that, they then possibly feel more confident in tackling controversial issues. I found a number of issues in common with Steve, as well as both being British, so we have a national identity in common, fascinatingly. But Steve was also referring to Dewey, and it's amazing how 100 years after his democracy and education, Dewey's work is still so remarkably influential. I was wondering actually whether in this context, Steve, in Europe there is now something of an interest, or I was going to say a fad. It's the latest trend to do Japanese lesson study activities, which for me would be a form of reflective teaching. I mean, very much so. But it's, I think, deeply embedded in Japanese educational culture and has become recognized as something to be taken up. A colleague of mine from IOE was going to the American Educational Research Association to talk about his perception of Japanese lesson study. And I wonder whether that is something that you have also worked with.
Yeah, maybe I'd just say something very quickly about that. I've been aware for a while about the importance of that kind of lesson study in Japan, and I do think that team process around that is an obvious feature of Japanese the way the world is seen in terms of the importance of relationships and group identity, and I think there is something that we could take from that process and maybe construct education or teacher life as less an individual pursuit. But on the other hand, there may be things that Japan can take from reflective enterprises and tools that are being used, and I think I would be against anything becoming the diet of reflective practice. But I absolutely agree with you, about the importance of Dewey, that link between the contrast between the global and the nation state. But I also share those interests in Charles Taylor's work, and that was a big influence on me in finding these spaces to articulate the grey areas between these big divisions. So I also heard echoes in the things that you said there. Perhaps I should pass over to Reiko.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, feminist pedagogy comes from Dewey's progressive education and also Freire's critical pedagogy. So I mean that's why the Dewey's progressive education and Freire's pedagogy and feminist pedagogy focus on consciousness raising and also social change. So I really like the idea, that kind of idea. But I have a question. Maybe I'm very challenging. I really like the idea about the cosmopolitan. I'm kind of skeptical about global person. I mean, in Japan, we often say global person, not the global student. And in Japanese context, especially in the business world, the global person means speak English fluently and go to the business in an international market. That's global person, and I'm very, very skeptical about the definition, and also I'm very how can I say critical about the English imperialism. I am teaching English, but am I doing right? And also the teaching language is strongly related to culture. So kind of, sometimes I'm teaching unconsciously American culture, and maybe I might tell students American culture is better than Japanese culture, or I try not to, but maybe unconsciously I might do it, and also, I'm kind of when I'm listening to Hugh's interview, what do you think about cultural relativism? I mean, as I said, as I mentioned, the David Peaty's quote, teaching if the international society accept the values for social justice, we shouldn't consider the teaching English about gender or socio-political issues as a doctrination. We shouldn't, But, for example, what is international society? Is it, the value is American or Western countries? And we often talk about human rights, but the value of human rights based on Western thought, or So Can I ask you the question?
Okay, those are very common myths.
Yeah.
Quickly. Global person. Clearly, there is elite cosmopolitanism, and those are business people flying around the world. But actually, who are the cosmopolitans in the modern world? Who are the people who migrate and settle in other countries? They're actually the migrants who are forced out of their home, the Syrians, the Vietnamese boat people, and so on, who are forced out of their country and then settle in other countries, but retain links with all over the world. They automatically have a cosmopolitan perspective, and they speak several languages as well. So these are the cosmopolitanism from below, if you like. You will only be teaching in an imperialistic way if you continue to make remarks like American culture is better. You don't have to say that. That those kind of value judgments are possibly not helpful. But they are encouraged probably by the way textbooks are still diplomatically formed. You say, what about cultural relativism? Now, this is a very interesting topic. Cultural relativism grew out of anthropology in the 1960s, really. And this was the view that as an anthropologist going into another society, you were imposing your own views on that society in your own framework of reference. So you should actually take into account the perspectives of the people you are examining. Now, this is all very well, but there are actually international global standards, and I don't think you can say that human rights are Western values. Who would say that? Well, in Singapore they say that. It may well be that Xi Jinping thinks that, though he wouldn't dare say it. But that is a construct. What is the basis of Chinese communism? It's actually Marxism, as I understand it. Well, who was Karl Marx? Well, he was this German refugee who worked in the British Library a lot, And are they going to throw that out? Are those Western imperialist values? There's a lot of confusion here. So culture is something that develops and changes and mutates. And there are standards by which you can judge whether a government or a society is doing well. You mentioned female genital mutilation.
Yeah.
I think everybody would say, this is outlawed. It's outlawed by law in the UK. So you can't invoke cultural relativism for that. It's an unhelpful. I think these days, just as postmodernism, which questions everything, is unhelpful for teachers. Teachers have to be anchored somewhere. So rather than cultural relativism, I've been arguing for cultural relationalism. You put cultures alongside each other and try and find ways in which they relate to each other. So cultural relationalism. That's in my book, Changing Citizenship.
And maybe just for the last few minutes, we'll see if the audience has any questions. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask the panel?
I have a question to Hugh. In Japan, the government is expecting a homeroom teacher to teach students English and nurture their global citizenship, the attitude towards global citizenship. But there are lots of homeroom teachers who has not trained as an English teacher, and also there still be a lot of they haven't had a trained as a sorry, they're not educated as a global citizenship education. So I think in Japan, especially in the elder people, there is a lot of stereotyped idea for the foreign countries and foreign culture. So I am a teacher trainer, and I've been observing a lot of the classes in elementary schools. So I've been concerned about the teachers' attitude towards language and culture affects a lot to the student. So I wonder how we can approach teachers' attitude.
Right. I think this will rely very much on CPD, continuing professional development. I think if the government puts in a reform as big as the language teaching reform and expecting homeroom teachers to do it, then they really must provide some support for those teachers. So one way or another, there does need to be training. Otherwise, also, teachers are going to be relying on the kind of materials that they're given. So one would want to try to influence the quality of those materials. And I think people who are teacher trainers may be in a position to influence the materials, which might happen more quickly than the CPD opportunities, possibly. But I recognise what you're talking about, and it won't happen easily, will it? It's going to be a long time to kind of train everybody to get this system working. But if the government wants it to work, it's going to have to invest in it and invest in the teachers.
It's easy to provide them skills and knowledges, but it's really, really difficult to change their attitude. Yeah, then that is the government, and we expect to the teacher to do, right?
Yeah, but I think the teacher needs reflection. Right? I mean, teacher needs reflection. But yeah, I really want to ask you, how to promote the reflection among teachers, because I don't know, maybe I am a very, very critical person, so I'm always reflect myself, that what is my responsibility, or what should I do, or something like that. But some teachers are not very, very critical. And how can you promote the reflection among teachers, in teachers' education?
Well, I guess the short answer to that is read the book that I've just published with Steve Walsh, because the whole book is about how teacher educators around the world have found ways to get people to reflect. But particularly, in answer to that question, one of the pernicious things that English is that there's the demand of it worldwide is pushing it down younger and younger. And so governments then have to say, well, homeroom teachers need to do this or that, and they might not necessarily be willing or able to do it. So, as Hugh says, there's a CPD or a training angle, but there's also this, to develop a reflective or community of practice where people can share ideas. But they need space, and that's what Gabrielle was talking about in his plenary, that there needs to be a commitment, even if it's only an hour a week, where institutes and governments say, it's not a case of flying more native speakers. Hugh did his after 1 week in Algeria. You were an English teacher because you'd been in America. The English language profession is full of these demands, and the responses aren't always the right ones. It's not a good idea to fly in native speakers necessarily. It's not a good idea to force people to teach English if they don't really want to, but if you are going to do that, you need to put in decent CPD, decent time, decent support, and also to develop a reflective culture, which is actually very, one of the things that Japan is good at with Kaizen and this idea of a kind of bottom-up innovation, that it's about finding the aspects of in Japan I'm talking about, where there is this kind of culture of working together. So that would be my short answer is read the book, but
Okay, I do.
Thanks for asking the question. I'll give you 100 yen later.
Okay, I think that's a nice place to finish things. So maybe let's have one more round of applause for the panel. Thank you very much.
We are the TEFLology Podcast, and thank you if you're already listening. Speaking of promoting books, we wrote a book about how podcasting and professional development, just how it's kind of our own story, but also hopefully some practical advice about how podcasting can be a form of professional development. It's an ebook, so it's available on Amazon for Kindle and on Smashwords, very competitively priced. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invite.